Hello, welcome back to the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum Virtual Speaker Series, where we have paleontology guests call in for a presentation on science, fossils, and dinosaurs, and where the public will be able to ask questions both here at the museum and live on YouTube. For the viewers at home, you can leave your questions in the comment section, and I will read them to our speaker at the end of the talk. First off, we want to acknowledge that we are on the homeland of the many diverse First Nations and Métis people whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. Today, Darren Tanke will be presenting successful efforts to relocate lost 100-year-old dinosaur quarries in the Badlands of southern Alberta. Darren was born in Alberta and by the age of 5 was into dinosaurs and earth sciences. In 1979, after leaving high school, he joined Philip J. Currie and was one of his paleontology technicians for 25 years. After Phil left for the University of Alberta, Darren continued on at Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, where he is now the longest serving employee there, about 41 years. Fieldwork assignments and research projects have taken him around the world. Research interests include ceratopsians, dinosaur paleopathologies, and paleontological history. Relocating lost dinosaur quarries for new information they contain will be the topic of this talk. Thank you, Darren, for joining us today. With that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Cam. Well, welcome to my first virtual talk. This is quite a departure from what I usually give. This will be a dinosaur talk today, but it'll be quite different from what you've probably seen in the past. My basic focus is looking for lost quarries, or identifying what we call mystery quarries. These are sites that we have found, but we don't know who was there, when, or what was collected. So we'll walk you through the procedures I do to help identify who was there, when, and what was collected. And I think by the end of this talk, you will really, truly believe that I am a dinosaur detective. So our story could take place anywhere in the world, anywhere where dinosaurs have been collected. People have not been recording locality data properly, so this is a worldwide problem. Today's talk will focus on the lower two of the dots on the map in what we see here in Dinosaur Provincial Park, which covers an area of about 80 square kilometers. It doesn't look like much happens here, but it's a very dynamic environment, and every time it rains, uncounted tons of sand and silt are washed off these hills. So after a year, you can see up to a centimeter of erosion happening. So when you're looking for a lost quarry, it was fresh and easy to see when it was emptied out 100 years ago, but now it's been eroding away for 100 years. So it becomes an abstract of a dinosaur quarry. So fortunately for us, a lot of the early collectors took photographs of the sites they were working. And here we can see a Centrosaurus quarry collected by the American Museum of Natural History in 1914. And the fun thing about these pictures is that you can go back to the exact spot where the picture was taken and do what's called repeat photography. So you can see how much the vegetation patterns have changed or how much the badlands have eroded. So if you see here my arrow, it's this thin, narrow white line and this little white peak. So that's 1914. And then this is about 5 years ago. That thin white line is now a broad white band, and that pointed peak has actually been reduced quite a lot in size. And you would never ever know that there was a dinosaur collected right there. So if we put the two pictures side by side, you can see how much the erosion has changed and how Mother Nature has reclaimed these old quarries. So they're very hard to find. Now, in Alberta, in southern Alberta, in the mid-1880s, people came right into the Badlands and marked all the area in a grid pattern with survey stakes. And this was all done in anticipation of immigrants from Europe and the United States moving into Alberta to set up farms. And accompanying these grid patterns were fairly primitive but useful maps. But the early collectors did not use them. If they had used this system, I wouldn't be giving this talk today. We would know exactly where every dinosaur skull and skeleton came from. What they did is they referred to this town, which is no longer extant, the town of Steveville. And they would say things like, 10 miles below Steveville, right bank, 100 feet above the river. Now, if I'm standing on the bank over here, looking upstream, the right bank is over here. But if I'm on this side of the river looking downstream, the right bank is over there. So it took quite a long time to figure out that whenever they talked about right bank or left bank, it was always looking downstream. 10 miles, they rarely used 10 and a half or 11 and a quarter. They were always rounded numbers, and 100 feet above the river is these images that you see here. And I could show you hundreds more, all matching that site description. So if you imagine trying to find a hole in the ground the size of an office desk or the size of a small garage that's been eroding for 100 years with poor locality information, it sounds almost impossible to do, but it's doable. I've solved, I think now 40 in Dinosaur Park, and working with others, about 41 or 42 in the Drumheller Valley. Now, as I said, the early collectors took photographs, but a lot of them are not labeled, so we don't really, they're fun to look at, but they don't really tell us a lot. Another issue is that photographs can be printed backwards, either by accident or deliberately. And I show this picture here, where I've just flipped one image. You can see, obviously this side is correct because you can see the word Bridgewater, whereas over here it's backwards. So you know right away the picture's backwards. But the early collectors did not wear clothing with words on them or numbers. They just wore regular clothes. And it's hard to tell sometimes if the photograph is printed the right way or backwards. And if you look in the background, the Badlands, one's a mirror image of the other, but they don't look backwards. They just look like Badlands. Another clue that I use in my project is shadow casts. I can tell here that this picture was taken earlier in the morning because of the way the shadows are being cast, versus over here, this would be late afternoon. Amongst the photographs too, there sometimes is information like Square Butte east of Sand Creek. Well, there's lots of Square Buttes east of Sand Creek, or Chasmosaur Quarry with a catalog date of 1913. Well, there were 3 quarries that year, so which one is it? So photographs, while they're useful, sometimes don't tell us a lot. Recognizing the potential for confusion, in the mid-1930s, Charles M. Sternberg developed what's called a quarry stake. And these are a bronze head, which is mounted onto a steel pipe, and then they would drill a hole in the floor of the empty quarry, put wet concrete in, and then put the quarry stake in, straighten it all out, and tap some numbers into it. And these numbers would assure you that you'd arrived at the right site. It would give you a quarry number and other information. And that was all tied into this map, which came out in 1950. And this was called the Bible of Dinosaur Quarries in Dinosaur Park up to 1950. And these little crossed pick and shovel icons are correlated to a table or legend with details of who was there, what was collected, and what year. But I discovered that there's about a 10% error rate on this map, which shocked some people because hardcore science has been done using this data. For example, how many tyrannosaurs are there in Dinosaur Park relative to hadrosaurs? So if the data is wrong, then your conclusions could be deeply impacted. Quarry staking is great, but there are some issues with it. You can see here, this is where the rock was in 1935 or 36, and it's dropped down, I think around 18 inches in this picture here. And we can have slumping of the wall behind the quarry to knock the quarry stake over and bury it completely. And we've actually had some instances of vandalism where people have yanked them out and thrown them down the hill. So that's an issue. So these are some of the problems I've had to encounter and deal with in the course of my research. A lot of the important quarry sites never got marked. They were considered not that important 50, 60, 70 years ago, but now we realize that they actually are quite important. So we need to find them. Some of these quarries have been marked wrong. They've got the wrong numbers. Some are not documented in any way. All we have is Steveville or Steveville Badlands downstream from Steveville. Even in published papers where they give coordinates for sites, when you go back with a photograph, you discover that they have written the coordinates down wrong, and they're actually a mile off. As I said, sites on the 1950 map have been, some of them are incorrect. A lot of the old field photographs are unidentified, so have limited value. Some that are identified turn out to be misidentified, and some photographs have been printed backwards. These photographs now are scattered all over the place. In fact, in San Diego, they have a set of photographs of Charles H. Sternberg from 1917 that are identified as him in the early 20s working in New Mexico. So that's a problem. We have very inconsistent field note records. Some people did good field notes, some people did none. And some of the historical accounts are also incorrect. The quarries, their sites are eroding away. I thought I could use people's faces, but Levi Sternberg in 1912 does not look like Levi Sternberg in 1934. So there's the aging process, the natural aging process of people, and even large numbers of transient summer staff. So I get these strangers that appear in photographs that are of little use to me. And one thing I will touch on today too is the incomplete sampling of sites. We're finding sites where we are discovering people have dug up fossils prior to us being there. So how do I solve these problems? Well, field notes where we have them, photographs where we have them. We can even grab stills out of motion picture film. There are historical accounts in books and newspapers. Garbage is a very useful clue, which I'll get into. Bottles, cans, and especially newspaper. My dad told me when I was a boy that I would be a garbage man when I grew up. He was trying to inspire me to be something better, do something good with my life. But now I find myself that he was actually partially right. I am a bit of a garbage man. I can do internet research, history, genealogy, and identifying artifacts I find in quarries. On Google Earth, I can match Badlands to photographs. And even geography and geology, I can look at vegetation and patterns in the river, the curvature of the river in photographs, and I can even match geology and stratigraphy. So by combining all these and a bit of luck and common sense and intuition, we can solve these sites. So I Googled years ago the word garbage, Google Images garbage, and I got this picture. And this is a great way to show you how you can date garbage. So for example, I cannot date this banana peel. It looks just like a banana peel did 100 years ago and a banana peel 100 years in the future. I could look up Starbucks coffee and find out when Starbucks started, or Dick's Restaurant. But the best clue here is Griffey for president. And I just simply Googled Griffey for president, and it took me to pictures of this baseball player and how he and his friends were joking with him about how he should run for president in 1996. And that told me right off the bat that this photograph was taken in 1996 or more recently. It was not taken in 1980. So we can use garbage and get clues to get the date of the site. Some of the garbage we can look at, like glass bottles, they can be broken or incomplete, and we can actually glue them back together and then compare them to antique bottle or jar collector catalogs. This bottle here is purple. We know automatically that that's pre-1920 because there were imperfections in the clear glass in the early days that react to UV light, and the glass turns purple. This was found in a 1930 quarry, this canning jar, and I was able to actually go to an antique shop in Drumheller and find the exact same canning jar. So I was able to determine what the original would have looked like. Moonshine jugs, now in the classic sense, these are filled with illegal liquor, but in the late teens, early 20s, these were actually used to hold shellac, which the paleontologists in the field used to glue the dinosaur bones back together and to stabilize them. So there's a very tight time period when these moonshine jugs were used in the field. So if I find one in the field, I know automatically it's from like late World War I, early 1920s vintage. So I can date things that way as well. Using old photographs, we see here a dig happening in 1921, and there's a can sitting there. You can just see the brush sticking out. This is a can of glue that the paleontologists are using in the quarry. There are a number of other photographs of this quarry at various times, and only one can is ever seen in those photographs. And when we went back to this site, there was one can in the quarry. So I'm pretty sure that this can here is the same can that we see in this old photograph. Another way we can solve things is what I call the cluster effect, where we have one collector, one area, 1 year. Now, all of these numbers that you see on this map are prefaced with 19 for 19. So this is a 1934 quarry. So if I'm looking for a lost Levi Sternberg quarry from 1934, this would be a good place to start looking. Or if I was looking for a Charles M. Sternberg quarry from 1928, this would be a good area to look. So we can eliminate large areas of the park automatically by doing this process of elimination. We've also been able to find dinosaur bone impressions in rock and take them or have them sent to other museums and have museums personnel fit the actual dinosaur bone back into the piece of rock that the bone came out of. And that helps us confirm that we're in the right spot and what came from there. Now, newspaper is the absolute best stuff to find in a quarry because every piece of newspaper, even tiny pieces, is totally unique to every other newspaper printed prior or since. So it's almost like a fingerprint. And if you know how to determine what newspaper it's from, you can determine its age, even its page number, and where the newspaper came from. So if you find newspaper from Toronto, you can associate that with the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, or the Ottawa Citizen newspaper is tied into the Geological Survey of Canada in Ottawa, now called the Canadian Museum of Nature. And this one's pretty cool. We even found on a piece of newspaper George F. Sternberg's address label, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up when I saw this, because this absolutely confirmed that George Sternberg had been in that quarry in 1922. The newspaper was used for a variety of purposes. Reading, of course, to keep up on what's going on around the world. They could use it for toilet paper. They could use it to light fires in the quarries. We've got pictures of them brewing up a pot of coffee. They would wrap the fossil pieces in newspaper. They would even use newspaper as separator between the fossil and the wet plaster of Paris and burlap jacket that was being made. So lots of uses for newspaper. And even if it's a tiny, tiny, tiny piece, you can do, originally I did microfilm searches, and I would actually get nauseous watching miles of microfilm slowly scroll by trying to make a match. But now most of the newspapers have been digitized and are online on places like Google News Archives, and you can do quick and easy searches. People ask me, how can newspapers survive in the Badlands, especially newspaper from long ago? And I use this example here. So here we have a quarry being excavated in 1922. George Sternberg on the right and an assistant are using a block and tackle, and they're going to lift a plaster jacket up, you can see in the lower right. And two very curious horses are watching the men at work, and one horse is a bit hungry and is eating some hay or straw out of the wagon and spilling it on the ground. So 77 years later, in 1999, me and a colleague went to this spot, and I told him I was going to go look for the hay that the horse spilled on the ground, knowing full well that it would have been buried eventually by eroded sediments. And there it is. And his jaw just hit the floor when he saw that, because there was absolutely no evidence of the straw on the surface of the ground, but it was underground by an inch. So seemingly fragile organic things can survive rain, freezing, frost, sunlight, wind, rodents. It can still survive. So now I've told you how I solve a mystery quarry, but I want to walk you through the actual solving of a particular case. I was hiking in the Badlands with some friends, telling them basically what I just told you for the last 15 minutes. And I came upon this scene and got very excited. And they're like, what? And I said, well, there's a rock right there. And that rock has been put on that outcrop by someone long ago. And when we went over to the rock and had a look at it, we could see that the rock had split into 3 pieces. And this is not bird poop. This is lichen. Lichen has grown on the rock and down into the crack. And we all know that lichen grows very slowly. So this rock was put there a long time ago. So I was pretty sure this rock was there to mark something a long time ago. So we started looking around, and I found this pail. Now, we know that the early collectors used pails to mix plaster for their plaster jacket. And because it's metal and has some weight to it, it can only go downhill from a site. So we went uphill, and I found plaster of Paris chunks. These are plaster that's dripped off the jacket as it's being applied. And that told me absolutely there's a quarry right in this very area. And now my friends were getting quite interested. They thought I was a bit of a nut when I first said it, but now they were interested. So in the wall of the quarry, which is about the size of an office desk, we found this newspaper. Now it's all stuck together with clay and sand and mud. So we carefully extracted it from the wall. We soaked it in warm water, and then you slowly, very, very, very slowly tease apart the individual pages looking for clues. And this was the first clue. I'm an antique car buff myself, so I knew right away that this was a car from around the late 20s, early 30s. But unfortunately for me, the artist didn't see fit to put the year on the license plate. So we kept looking for more clues, and we got this. Now, this was great. We've got a lady in flapper style clothing and other clues, which I'm going to show you here. Flapper style clothing, 8/31, that is August 31st. You look at any comic strip, even today, somewhere it'll have this date to show you, sometimes even the year, but this newspaper did not. Then it talks about last year, 1926. That tells me that this newspaper is August 31st, 1927. And then it talks about number of traffic fatalities in Toronto. Well, no one in New York City or Ottawa would care how many traffic fatalities there were in Toronto. So this is a Toronto newspaper, and I called a library in Toronto, and they did a quick search for me and confirmed it was the Toronto Star. So that's how we knew it was a 1927 Royal Ontario Museum quarry. And then we went through their specimen lists for that year, and the only site that was 1 mile south and a mile and a half west of the mouth of Sandhill Creek was a partial ceratopsian skull quarry. So we knew that that was where that skull came from. Sometimes we even find bone fragments accidentally left behind or deliberately left behind that we can then use to determine what type of dinosaur was pulled out of there. And there's the quarry. So you can see you would never know that was a quarry. When that was first made, there would have been rubble all down the hill, and there would have been sharp angular cuts in the wall, but they've all gently been rounded over, and now you're looking at like an abstract of a quarry. Now I want to move on to another topic about the headhunting of dinosaurs and the selective bone sampling and how it adds a whole new twist to the problem that I'm experiencing trying to find and solve these quarries. So this is kind of how I feel. I've got Alberta vertebrate paleontology history. It all happened, but here I am tangled up in it because they didn't record proper locality data. That's the most important thing when you find a fossil, to record exactly where you found it spatially and stratigraphically where you found it. If you don't have that information, the fossil's usefulness to a scientist is greatly reduced. So when we think of headhunting, these kind of pictures come to mind. You think of a primitive tribe in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but these are dinosaur headhunters. And these are all men probably known to a lot of you. These men were perfectly fine to lop the head off a dinosaur and take it to their museum, leaving the headless torso behind. And then when you have 100 years of erosion, you go, aha, I found a dinosaur skeleton. Too bad it hasn't got a head. You collect it, you catalog it, never knowing that the head is at another museum on the other side of the continent. So these are just some examples of some of the hadrosaur heads that we've been able to reassociate with skeletons that are either still in the ground or have been collected by other museums. So it's a serious problem, but it gets worse. We have cases where here you see Peter Kaizen says on August 9th, 1910, that he found 2 skeletons, but the limb bones were fair. And then the next day they decided to take out one front limb of this dinosaur. So right now, out in the field somewhere, or in a museum somewhere, is a dinosaur missing its front leg, but no one knows. We're able to determine from his field notes that this is the specimen it is, AMNH, which is the American Museum of Natural History 5200. So we can associate the specimen to the field note, but we can't associate the limb to the dinosaur, which is still out in the hills somewhere, or is in a museum. Here's another one. Maybe some of you have seen this beautiful picture of a hind leg of a Gorgosaurus. Well, now 100 years of erosion later, we're starting to find things like jaws and skull bones and other bones from the body of this animal. So we're going to have to go back and re-excavate an already excavated quarry, and we're going to end up having an animal in Ottawa with one number and the rest of the animal in Drumheller with our catalog number. So the surprise which was promised in the advertising for this talk is this part of the talk now. It all started on July the 4th, 2007. I was walking through the Badlands and I found some little short lengths of wire on the ground, like here, even one with a loop and part of a can rim and a nail. Now, a nail and wire, these were used, they would build wooden crates on site. They'd have some straw in them, and then they would put the plaster jacket inside the case, put more straw or hay in, then put a lid on it, and then they would use nails and wire to seal the box tight so it wouldn't come apart when it was being shipped by railroad back to their museum. There was absolutely nothing else there except these. And these weren't laying just like this. They were scattered over, I don't know, 20 by 15-foot area. But I marked them in my GPS as wire and continued on my merry way. We went back to the site in 2018, and this was sticking out of the hillside. This is the end of a left tibia of a plant-eating dinosaur. We decided it looked kind of like ankylosaur, so we decided to excavate one tibia. That was the intention, one tibia. But as we excavated further, we discovered this bone here is an ankylosaur femur. And then later we found tendons. So we started to get very excited. This told us that this might be an old quarry. And when we looked around, we found a tiny, tiny crumb of plaster on the surface. So we knew someone had been there, but we didn't know who, when, or what they dug up. We knew they dug up an ankylosaur, but we didn't know which ankylosaur. So this is what an ankylosaur looks like, the ones with the club on the end of the tail. There's others that have big spines on the sides and no club, but the armor suggested to us it was one of these types of armored dinosaurs, Euoplocephalus. So we've been working at the site for a couple days, and I stood up for a stretch and turned around and had a huge epiphany, a huge light bulb moment. This wedge of clay I had seen in an old photograph. I was pretty sure of it. I had all these old photographs of dinosaur digs, and there was one that had a big wedge of dark clay in the background that someone had sent me years earlier. So I was so sure of it when we got back to the field station in Dinosaur Park. I fired up my government email and I went back through all my emails from one particular person, and I discovered that 4 years and 2 months earlier, he'd sent me this image. Now, why I'd remember this, I don't know, just the way my head is wired, I guess, but it's the same site. When you put the two pictures side by side, you can see it's the same site. There's been, even the drainage channels are the same. This sandstone ridge has dropped down substantially in the time that from the time these pictures were taken. So, oops, something's happened here. So anyway, this picture here was taken in 1913, and it said ankylosaur. That's all it said. So we knew it was the same site, and we knew it was an ankylosaur because we were finding ankylosaur bones. As we dug down, we could see where they had been digging previously. These are all jumbled up pieces of rock. And then we have the edge of the quarry here, and then in situ rock. In situ is untouched virgin rock. It hasn't been touched with a pickaxe or anything. So we could see where the edge of the quarry was. We even found mud cracks. So after they left the quarry, there would have been a hole in the ground, which gradually filled in with water and silt. And there would be periods where it would be dry for a long time, and the mud cracks would dry up, and then more sediment would wash on top. So that was kind of cool to find. And then as we were digging a drainage channel, because you don't want to have your quarry fill up with water after a rain, we found some newspaper. And so this was very, very exciting. We knew already the quarry was 1913. So we expected to find that this newspaper was also 1913, and it was. So we were pretty sure that the photograph was 1913. It's a 1913 quarry. It's American Museum. It's an ankylosaur. Everything's good. So we decided to go look at all the specimens of ankylosaurs that were collected by the American Museum in 1913. And they had a very good year for ankylosaurs. They found 9. Now, some were single bones, some were partial skeletons, but by process of elimination, we could reduce this list down to a more manageable number. So there's Steville in the upper left. These are mile below, 2 miles below, 3 miles below Steville. The American Museum number distances get kind of out of whack when they get down to the core area of Dinosaur Park. When they talk about 10 to 12 miles below Dinosaur Park, it's actually about 8 or 8.5 miles below. And here's the quarry that we're working down here. So knowing, like this specimen here, 1913-1, 1 mile below Steveville, left bank, it's on the wrong side of the river. So we can eliminate quarries that are being excavated on the wrong side of the river. We can eliminate this one here, number 21. It's the left ilium, a hip bone. It's a single bone. We can eliminate it. That left us with 2. These 2 right here. So now we investigate these a little more closely. And then we found out that one of them had a quarry marker in it already, which left us with 1. And it said AMNH 5405, part of skull, caudal plates. Now, caudal plates, it's important to understand that the tail club of an armored dinosaur is made of a major plate here and a minor plate here. And the implication is caudal plates, they didn't actually say tail club. They said caudal plates. So I want you just to file that in your back of your head for a second. Now, AMNH 5405 is a very well-studied specimen. It was recently redescribed as Platypelta coombsi by Paul Penkalski in 2018. So being able to find exactly where this skeleton came from was very important. And now we actually had parts of the hind legs also preserved. So we could actually add more to this animal. So by the end of the 2018 field season, we had a row of tendons here, a row of tendons running underneath the femur, the tibia, and right like the last couple days, one of our technicians knocked off a piece of rock and exposed that chunk. And we thought, okay, it's a caudal plate, more of the tail club that will fit on to the incomplete tail club at the American Museum. The tendons also, we thought there was more of the tail underneath, which it didn't turn out to be, but pretty cool. So here's the caudal plate with my boot for scale, and I'm gonna put a red oval over it in the next number of images to just so you can orient yourself where we're at. So we thought it was this part of a tail club, but all of this is not true. Everything I've told you about this ankylosaur is not true, and it just goes to show you how easy it is to get tricked by incomplete data. Why was it not true? Because as I started to uncover the caudal plate, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and turned into a complete tail club. So AMNH 5405 already had caudal plates, and this tail club had all of them. And it was a huge tail club, 1.7 meters long. So these are all the fused vertebrae that attach to the club. So either AMNH 5405 had 2 tail clubs, which is impossible, or it's not AMNH 5405. So who was it? Which ankylosaur was it? So I had to dig into even more obscure things like end of field season reports and newspaper articles. They always tell you never believe everything you read in a newspaper. Well, in this case, it turned out to be true. In 1913, after the 1913 field season, he notes 3 fine specimens were found and covered up for 1914 field season. So next year, one is a partial skeleton with the pelvis and dorsal series with ribs attached. There's also talk of a monoclonius with caudal vertebrae that were exposed and a connected skeleton of Dinodon, which is an old name for Gorgosaurus. Now, when you go to Google Earth, these are sites that I've actually located as well. So here's the ankylosaur quarry that we're digging up right here. The Centrosaurus with the tail eroding out is there, and the Dinodon connected is right there. So we're in the same area. So it looked like the specimen might have been collected in 1914 as well. When we take the field photograph and not do any photo manipulation other than zooming in and do a drawing, you can see that there's a whole bunch of ribs going one way and a bunch of ribs going that way, and there's probably a line of vertebrae going through here. So This is them getting the specimen ready, and because they're in a trench, it was raised up from the surrounding terrain and was safe from spring rains and winter snowmelt. Then the newspapers, Barnum Brown, okay, he says that he found enough material to reproduce the weird ankylosaurus in its entirety. That's this specimen. It's not ankylosaurus, it's an old name for a lot of tail-clubbed ankylosaurs. It's Euoplocephalus. And this one, it says they found, before leaving the same region, they found a number of valuable specimens which they will dig up this summer. And this summer, this paper came out in 1914. So they went back and specimens were worked on one year and finished the next. So knowing that, we went to the 1914 list. There's only 2 skeletons of ankylosaurs that year. One was too poor to be collected. They just collected a few little bits and pieces. And then they describe this one, 5337. So we now know that AMNH 5337 is our same animal as our specimen. So it was excavated in 1913 and 1914. So AMNH 5337 is also a significant ankylosaur. It's one of the most complete ones known from Dinosaur Park, and now it's even more complete. The spatial and stratigraphic context of this lost AMNH site is now known. We don't have a lot of good locality data for almost all of the American Museum quarries. It's also the second specimen now that has a skull and tail club together. And if Penkalski is right, and it is a new animal called Platypeltacumzi, then we now know exactly spatially and stratigraphically where it came from. So this is a very important and significant rediscovery. But how do we know it really is 5337? We've been burned once already with our thoughts that it was AMNH 5405 or 5305, and it wasn't. So how do we really know? So I plotted out what numbers of bones the AMNH had found of each type versus us. So this number 2 here means that the AMNH found 2 radii, 2 ulna, 1 pelvis. So they've got all this bone, and we don't. We don't have anything from the front of the animal. We have only stuff from the back. What you don't want to have is 2 of the same bone, like 2 upper right arm bones. If you have 2 of those, you're hooped. There's only 1 bone that each museum has. That's this bone right here, the ischium. We have one, the American Museum has one. So I wrote to the American Museum and said, please send me photographs with a scale bar. And then they emailed me back a picture, and then I took a picture of ours, scaled them up to the same size. One's a right, one's a left, and one is 3 millimeters longer than the other. So it's the same animal. But this also raises a big question. Between 1915 and 1997, when we got GPS, handheld GPS, all of these people or museums seen here in the middle were in Dinosaur Provincial Park collecting fossils. It's quite possible that in 1927, a member of the Royal Ontario Museum happened upon this quarry, and there was a metacarpal, one of the hand bones, sitting on the surface, and collected it and cataloged it as an isolated metacarpal, not knowing that the rest of the animal is in New York City. So it's possible that this animal has been sampled by different expeditions over 100 years, and all these bones have different numbers now, and trying to reassociate them is quite problematic. So how truly complete is a specimen when you find it? You don't know. It may have been headhunted in 1914. It could have been sampled for a particular limb bone in 1932. You just don't know. And this is the problem that I'm now discovering, is that not only do we have bad locality data or poor locality data, we've got people sampling bones. So if the American Museum has an hadrosaur that's missing an upper arm bone and they see one on an articulated skeleton, They take it out, they collect it, and then 80 years later, I come along and I have not a clue that they were there earlier and took that upper arm bone. Just to show you how close the American Museum came to finding the bones that we did, here's the edge of the quarry. There's the ex situ rock we looked at. The newspaper was found here. The hind limb with tendons were here. And I don't know if you can see the tail club block, but it would be under where my talking head is. That's how close they came to finding even more of the specimen. But for reasons unknown, they stopped work and went on to collect something else. So there could be any number of reasons they quit. It could be the end of the field season. Barn and Brown found something more neat, so they asked them to hurry up and finish, or they just got sick and tired of the quarry and just move on to something else. We just don't know. They're not around to ask anymore. So we were hoping to go back this year because there's still a lot more of the animal missing. We're missing both hands, the right lower jaw, the predentary, so it's the lower beak, the hind feet are missing, the neck and ribs are missing, neck ribs are missing, and the vertebrae between the tail club and the pelvis, which the American Museum has, are also missing. And we seem to have, both museums seem to have a peculiar rarity of armor. So we're thinking that the armor might be somewhere nearby. They're typically found on their backs, and maybe the armor stayed anchored into the ground and the rest of the body kind of slid off and disarticulated. So hopefully we'll be able to get back there this coming summer if the pandemic is over, or we've got a vaccine available. Hard to say, hopefully. If we do have to go back, we're going to have to take down a lot of rock. The specimens are sitting on an 8-degree dip, probably reflecting the topography of the ancient river bottom. And if we have to go back into this outcrop here, for every foot we go back, the height of the overburden will become commensurately larger. This is what the quarry looked like this summer. You can see it's already eroding away. Plants are reclaiming the hole, and the sharp edges of the outcrops where we chopped into it are all starting to round off. So I suspect if we don't put a quarry marker in this, someone will come upon this scene in 100 years and never know that the American Museum was there in 1913-14 and the Tyrrell Museum was there in the early 2020s. So now what do? We've got an animal in 2 museums with 2 catalog numbers. How do we reassociate it? We could surrender all of our bones to the American Museum, but I don't think that's going to happen. We could ask the American Museum to surrender all of their bones from this animal to us, and that's not going to happen. So minimally, we should be able to share photographs, measurements, and photogrammetry models in 3D of the animal for research. But what I'm actually hoping will happen is that we come to some agreement where we either mold and cast all of the original material and then do a trade. So we could all have casts of each other museum's original material. Another possibility is to make photogrammetry models. So we get 3D photogrammetry models of all the bones. This is the tail club, the top half of the tail club. So the dorsal view of the tail club in a 3D photogrammetry model. Also, while I was working on this tail club, I couldn't help but notice a face in that. And I just keep seeing ET whenever I look at this tail club from the back. It's surprisingly similar. But anyway, getting back to modeling, we could either make models by taking a solid block of plastic and machining it down to the bone, or we can do 3D printing where we do a additive manufacturing. And then each museum would have part of a real ankylosaur and the rest would be casts. And by doing that, you would have a very complete ankylosaur on opposite sides of the North American continent, which would greatly assist researchers if you're in San Francisco and you want to see it, you can come to the Terrell and see the 3D print and the original. And if you decide that you absolutely must see the original of the rest of the animal, then you can go to New York City to study it. So I think you'll agree that this is a pretty cool project, pretty unique, but it can be applied to other fossil sites around the world. I really enjoy doing it. It's a real detective story, and it's pretty cool to find specimens that were abandoned a little too early and stand in the footsteps of your heroes from long ago. And with that, I will end, and I'd like to thank these people for their assistance on this project, and I'm free to answer any questions now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Darren. It was honestly quite the pleasure to actually have you on for these kind of talks. I guess right now we'll move on to our question period. And if anyone has any questions, they can type them again into the comment box. So we do have a couple. First one comes from Caleb Thomas. I have a question. Has quarry 223, where the Daspletosaurus specimen, FMNH PR308, been found?
Yes. We have photographs. That specimen was originally collected by the American Museum around the same time as this ankylosaur. And we have photographs of them lowering a very heavy block down a hill. So I was able to find the hill and climb up it and then walk around to the top, and I was able to find the quarry up there.
Excellent, excellent question too. Here's one from Calla Scott. Has there been a push to create a public database of digitized old field notes?
I don't know about a public database, but there is, as we speak, people are typing up all of the Sternberg field notes, all of the Barnum Brown notes, Peter Kaisen's notes, and combining them together. Yes. One of them is very difficult. Charles H. Sternberg's handwriting is virtually impossible to read. And unfortunately, he was the one guy that wrote the most field notes. So someone tried it in the 1970s and people accepted them as correct. And when I compared the typed notes to the handwritten notes, they were quite different actually. So hopefully someone in Ottawa has dealt with deciphering his chicken scratch.
Another one from Calla. Are you working on any other mysteries right now?
Yes, I have probably about a dozen mystery quarries to try to solve, but the problem is some of them have no clues at all. All I know is that someone was there and they dug something up. I don't even know if it was a dinosaur skull or a large turtle shell. I just don't know. And others I've got newspaper, but there's not enough clues in the newspaper to tell me what year it is, where it was published. I have nothing. So, and I just turned 60 recently. There were hundreds and hundreds of quarries excavated, and only about 200 of them out of maybe 500 were ever marked with a quarry stake. So I will not in my lifetime solve this. So I'm hoping that in the next decade or so, I will teach some young person all of this, and they will have the same passion as I to seek out lost quarries and identify mystery quarries.
You certainly have inspired a generation to do so.
Well, it's important work. Like if you have, let's say you're trying to do a study on biostratigraphy of Styracosaurus, and there's 4 specimens and only one has locality data, that's just one pin on a chart. But if I can go back and find the 3 lost quarries, then the database becomes much more useful. If I don't do it, you have to find more Styracosaurus specimens yourself, dig them up and prepare them and confirm that they are Styracosaurus, and then do your research that way. So the fun thing about this project is my research corroborates the research that others have done about dino biostratigraphy. For example, Styracosaurus is only found high in section in the Dinosaur Park Formation. So that confirms what they're saying, but because they're saying that, if I'm looking for a lost Styracosaurus quarry, I know only to look high in section. So it's a you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of scenario, which helps me relocate lost sites. It shrinks the search area stratigraphically significantly.
Absolutely. It's such a great network.
Yeah.
Here's another question from Colt. Do you think amateur collectors pose a significant threat to lost bone beds that reside on unprotected land?
He said lost bone beds?
Yes, lost bone beds.
Well, if it's lost, I don't know it exists, right?
Yeah.
So I'm after quarries. Some of my quarries are in bone beds, but I would have to say, no, they're not a threat to lost bone beds. But it brings up an interesting point where we have a lost bone bed in Dinosaur Park somewhere. The horned dinosaur Spinops was excavated in 1916. I have 2 site photographs, but the camera is aimed right at the fossils in the ground. So all I can tell is which way the camera's facing from shadows, but we're unable to find the bone bed itself. And so we have these partial skulls in London, England of a new type of dinosaur, and there's still some questions about the frill anatomy. And as we speak, there are Spinops bones in a bone bed in Dinosaur Park eroding away, but we don't know exactly where it came from. But we're still looking, still trying to solve that mystery.
I love the mystery behind these. They're truly intriguing. Next
Yes.
one is from Brillo Bird. Are there any chemical / elemental or mineralogical testing that could match bones to the same animal?
The same animal, I would say no, but it's been done in Mongolia to match bones to specific areas of Mongolia.
Mm-hmm.
One thing we were trying, we were actually saving plaster at all these old sites, known sites and mystery sites, in the hopes that maybe we could do some chemical analysis on them that would tell us that this plaster is 1917 plus or minus 2 years. But it's irrelevant. I'm finding more information more quickly using the newspapers. The important thing, when I first started doing this was in 1999, it took me weeks and months to solve a single site. And lately, I've solved sites in as little as 10 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And with each site that I solve, that makes the problem in the bigger context a little easier the next time around.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Another one is from Josh Doyen. Has there been any similar investigations done by others for other important quarries in other places around the world?
Hi, Josh. I would say no, but definitely in the United States, but nowhere overseas. The United States, there's been some efforts to relocate some of Barnum Brown's quarries, like the T-Rex quarries.
Oh yeah.
But I was in Mongolia in 2005, and I was in mystery quarries that were full of trash that had Polish writing on them. So we knew it was the Mongolian Polish expeditions from the mid-1960s. But Phil Curry's actually got on to solve some of those. So I stand corrected. Yes, some people have been doing this work overseas as well. But wherever dinosaur skeletons have been dug up in the last 150, 200 years, there's poor locality data for a lot of them. Like how in the middle of, for example, the Spinosaurus quarries in North Africa, it's very flat there with a few peaks here and there, and there's no way, unless you took a lot of photographs and drawings and actually measured with the odometer on your truck how far it was away, a lot of these sites I think are gone. They're just gone forever.
Absolutely. Another one from Kala. What was the most exciting clue you have figured out?
Probably that mailing label with the George F. Sternberg mailing label. I mean, he's like a god to us. and you know, you say, okay, here's a sheet of newspaper, a big piece of newspaper, and you're brushing the dirt off of it, and then you see that it's got G.F. Sternberg. And my jaw dropped. I got up and just said, hey, come and have a look at this. And they looked at me with their jaw wide open too. It was like, holy smokes, George F. Sternberg's newspaper.
A jumping up and down moment, truly.
Yeah.
Jason Peck, do private land and landowners hinder your access to locals in the Drumheller Valley?
I would say generally no. Most landowners we have good relationships with. Unfortunately, near Dinosaur Park, where I think the Spinops bone bed is, that landowner has consistently not wanted us on his land. And I really want to go there because, as I was telling your moderator, in 1982, I found a big plaster jacket about the size of a tractor tire sitting there, and it was all falling apart, and there was burlap hanging out of it. And I had another epiphany that this might be a plaster jacket from the Spinops bone bed, because when they were excavating that site in 1916, they were having trouble with the bone pouring out of the bottom of the jacket when they tried to roll the jacket over. So they wrote to England and said, shall we continue here or go after more complete skeletons? And they were told to go after more complete skeletons. So I think that tractor-sized jacket might be Spinops bone bed. So I'd love to go there, re-jacket it, get it out of there, open it up, and maybe we'll find 1916 newspaper as separator, or we'll find ceratopsian bones inside, and then we'll know where Spinops came from. It's a very controversial stratigraphic problem. We had matrix from England brought back to Canada to do a palynological analysis. So we're looking for ancient pollen or spores, and they can sometimes give you a good stratigraphic context. But unfortunately, it just said Upper Oldman Formation or the entire Dinosaur Park Formation. So the pollen analysis didn't help us one way. We even had the man who re-prepared the Spinops material come to Canada in the hopes that he would recognize the rock in the ground, because it has it's a tan colored rock with these gold colored flecks in it. And we were hoping as we walked around, he would spot the same colored rock on the ground, but it didn't happen either. So it's the holy grail of lost dinosaur sites for me right now.
Let's hope you solve that one. That one sounds like the solve of a lifetime.
Yes.
I'm not seeing any more questions. I can leave it for just a little bit longer.
Okay. I guess while your audience is watching, like if you do find a significant fossil in this day and age, most people have GPS, most people have a camera, a digital camera. Photograph the site facing north, facing south, east and west, and get GPS coordinates. It's so often I have people bring me something really neat, and I say, okay, take me to the site. It's really important. Take me to the site. And I walk behind them, and I'm watching for what I call the Jesus. And as they're walking around, suddenly their hands will rise up to their sides, and they'll say, I know it's around here somewhere. And that means they can't find it. And most of the time they cannot find it. And then I know that we've lost a really valuable specimen. In Dinosaur Park, one year a parks employee brought me a wad of newspaper. So it obviously came from an old quarry. So I said, take me out there And he did the same thing. He just, his hands raised up to the sky, and he's like, I know it's around here somewhere, and we've never found it again. So I have a lot of newspaper from World War I with no context whatsoever.
Oh, no.
So if you find a site that you want to report to a museum, take lots and lots of pictures, put something for scale in the picture. If you don't have a ruler, you know, some keys. I've had people who are out hunting and they put a bullet next to it for scale, something for scale, and make sure the pictures are in focus.
Yes.
That way you can get back to the site.
That is a brilliant remark, actually. There isn't another question, but there is a remark coming from Sarah Doyle. No question, just want to say this was tremendously interesting. My background is historical rather than paleontological, and I appreciate seeing this kind of work being done.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Sarah. I'm hoping one day, if I don't kick the bucket, I would like to do a book, a coffee table picture book, where you open up the pages, and in the upper left half of the page is the old photograph, and then the upper right is the modern photograph, and then the lower half of the 2 pages will be historical information and maybe photographs or drawings of the specimen. I think that would be a pretty cool historical book. But I got so many historical projects on the go right now. I've got, I think, about 55 manuscripts on the go right now. So I get 6 published a year, and of course more historical projects come along that you didn't know would happen. Like this. This was supposed to be just an ankylosaur tibia, and it turned out to be the hind end of an ankylosaur, and maybe more. If, you know, once we get digging in there, who knows what else we'll find.
My goodness. Well, you're truly doing tremendous work so far.
Thank you very much.
I don't see any more questions. I think this will wrap up question period. Join us again for our next virtual speaker series on Saturday, December 5th at 3 p.m. Presenting all the way from Zurich, Switzerland, PhD candidate Melina Jobbins will be giving a special talk similar to the Burgess Shale material, which is titled First African Thylakocephalans from the Late Devonian Lagerstätte. Thank you again to Darren and to all of you for tuning in. Cheers.